If you would like to earn CPE credit for listening to the show, visit earmarkcpe.com/FPA. Download the app, take a short quiz, and get your CPE certificate. Finally, if you enjoy listening to FP&A Today, please go to your podcast platform of choice, click the subscribe button, and leave a rating and review of the show. And now, on to the show.
From data rails, this is FP&A Today.
Welcome to FP&A Today. I'm your host, Glenn Hopper. Today, I'm excited to welcome Craig Berry to the show. Craig is a strategic finance consultant, fractional CFO, and startup advisor with nearly 20 years of experience helping companies scale, fundraise, and navigate M&A. He's held senior finance roles at some of the most iconic companies in tech and entertainment, including LinkedIn, Pixar, Lucasfilm, and Electronic Arts. At LinkedIn, he led central forecasting, supported more than 10 acquisitions, and played a key role in the company's integration with Microsoft. At BioRender, he built the FP&A function from the ground up, helping the company scale ARR from 18 million to 50 million and secure a major Series A round with top-tier VCs. Today, Craig runs Clearsight IQ, where he works with SaaS companies and startups on strategic finance, fundraising, and M&A readiness. He joins us to share his incredible career journey, how FP&A can evolve from reporting to value creation, and what startups can do to truly understand their metrics and investor positioning. Craig, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Glenn. Really happy to be here. Really appreciate the invite for the show and happy to meet you and talk today.
Yeah, I just, as we were talking before the episode, LinkedIn, Pixar, Lucasfilm, Electronic Arts, you've had some cool gigs at some really exciting companies. I think about, me in a lot of service industries and B2B kind of less cool companies. I think that, a lot of times we think in FP&A, it's like, well, whatever, we're just, it's FP&A. It doesn't matter what the product we're selling. But it seems like, if you're at Pixar and Lucasfilm, it's a little cooler than, business advisory services or whatever. So let's back up maybe even before that and start with your story, with your non-traditional path into finance, where you started in environmental studies and you were teaching abroad and you almost were pursuing accounting. Kind of walk us through that sort of winding road that led you to a career in strategic finance.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, as you mentioned, I started out by going and doing an undergraduate degree in environmental studies, which was almost by mistake as well. I actually did my first year in pure math. I'd always been a good math student in high school, and it seemed like the obvious choice. So I went to the University of Waterloo. I'm Canadian. So Waterloo, great math school, great computer science school. So I went there to study pure mathematics. And what I discovered was that university math was very different from high school math. And 1 year was enough. I hated it. And so I did a complete 180 and went into environmental studies, completed my degree there. And then, quickly learned that there's not a lot of need for people with undergraduate degrees in environmental studies. And so rather than enter the job market or go back to school, I actually decided to go and teach English in Korea, as you mentioned. So I did that for a couple of years, about a year and a half. Did a lot of traveling throughout Southeast Asia and Southern Africa, and then sort of realized I needed to, get a real job. So that's when I started looking at, okay, well, what can I actually do? So reaching out to some friends from university and just seeing what other people had done over the sort of 3 or 4 years that I was traveling. And a couple of people had gone through the accounting path and had joined CA firms. And so just talking to them, it seemed like an interesting career path. I'd always loved math, so it felt like it was something that would fit with me. And so I sort of explored that and, found a program back in Canada at the University of British Columbia. And I moved back to Canada, moved to Vancouver. And then I did that program, which was sort of the best way to describe it is a bridging program for people with a non-commerce background. So if you want to become a CPA, or it was a CA at that time, you had to do this, and then you could be eligible to go work in sort of Big Four accounting. So that was my career goal. So I went through that program. It was a 12-month intensive program, and I wanted to get hired by a Big Four accounting firm. I got an offer from Deloitte, which was great. So perfect. I was going to be able to do the thing that I wanted to do. But for whatever reason, I sort of randomly had a resume in with Electronic Arts, and they called me for a junior FP&A analyst position. And so even though I had the offer from Deloitte, this was happening at the same time. I went and interviewed with Electronic Arts. I actually ended up getting the job. despite having no experience, which was great. I don't know if, the guy that hired me, his name's Murray Kettle. He gave me my first sort of career break, and I'm always thankful to him for that. Anyway, now I was sort of faced with the decision. What do I do? Do I follow my dream of becoming a CPA, or do I actually go and work in, a much cooler industry like video games? And so I took the latter option. I decided to sort of pass on the Deloitte option and go and work for Electronic Arts, knowing really nothing beyond sort of the academic piece of finance that I'd learned over the prior 12 months. So it was really a crash course in what FP&A did. I had no idea walking in the door on my first day. So I'm still, surprised they hired me actually.
And we can talk about them because they're not here, but FP&A, the math you do is way cooler than accounting. Accounting math is what? Subtraction. It's credit minus debit. If that doesn't equal zero, it's a problem. Other than that, but not as much math maybe in accounting as there is in FP&A.
Yeah, no, totally. It was based on, what I'd done in the 12 months prior to working at FP&A. I thought I'd spend a lot more time working on trial balances, but it's something that doesn't really come up in the world of FP&A. And so it's something I've never really touched, since those 12 months at UBC, which was, I graduated from there in 2005. So it's been a while.
It's interesting that you say trial balance, because where I do see using trial balance in FP&A is an M&A activity sometimes, especially when you start getting into weird adjusted EBITDA. It's like, you know what? Don't give me your financial statements because I don't believe them. Just give me your trial balance. I'll put everything where it needs to go. But that's the only time I've thought about a trial balance in FP&A. Man, but if I were looking at, was it at Deloitte, was it going to be in the audit group?
It was, yeah, it was. So I would have joined as a first year audit student.
Yeah.
And most of my classmates, I think when I was at UBC, I think probably there may be 100 of us in this program. And I think, everybody except me, I think went into audit. And so I'm well aware of what they went through over the next 3 years. Well, because you're working and, you're on a lot of different files at the same time, but you're studying as well because you're preparing to write, the exam at the end. Right. And so I think at the time it was like 6 modules. So it's, you're working 60 hours per week and, you're studying another 10 or 15 or something like that. So it was really quite intense, not to lean on those people too hard, but I mean, I had probably a little bit better work-life balance and I got paid more. So it was definitely the right choice.
And I never do this, but I guess I'm just feeling like feisty today. I want to just knock on the straight accountants because I mean, they're having a hard time bringing people into accounting, but so many people are, there's a lot of reasons for that, but so many people who maybe would have gone into accounting, they look at Indeed or whatever, or job postings and they see, wait a minute, first year finance people are making more than regular, audit or tax or, whatever you're doing in accounting. So it makes sense that that's drawing some people over too.
Yeah. I think when I was in school, I think the way that it was being sold to us was if you wanted to have, a successful career in finance and reach either, the C-suite or senior level, you needed to be a CA or a CPA. Whereas, with this sort of experience I have behind me, I don't think that's actually the case anymore. I mean, I think people can be successful without an accounting background.
Yeah. And I was actually just talking to another CFO about this last week, and I want to see the actual hard data on it. But anecdotally, what it feels like is the number of CFOs with CPAs as a percentage seems like it's gone way down in recent years. And I need to find some, can't be saying this all the time without data. I need to find some data to back that up.
Yeah. I mean, I saw it firsthand at LinkedIn. We had, the initial CFO that was there, Steve Sordello, the guy that took the company public. He was a CPA. And then when he retired, it was actually our head of FP&A, the VP of FP&A that took the role. And he did not have an accounting background. He actually had an investment banking background. And then, about like 8 years of experience at LinkedIn as well.
Yeah. But an investment banking background, if you're doing a bunch of M&A, it's kind of, that probably makes more, you still have to know how to account for the transactions, but the kind of stuff you're looking at, the strategic stuff.
I think if you have a strong controller in place, you can lean on them pretty heavily for, the pieces that you don't understand. I don't think any CFO really gets all of it all the time. So you have to surround yourself with good people who are experts in their own domain. And I think this worked well for this fellow at LinkedIn.
I want to peel Lucasfilm off because as a Star Wars fan from the original movie, dating myself here, we'll talk about them separately, I guess. But So EA come into that instead of Deloitte. That I sort of understand the sort of mental math that you did and looking at that. And then, but EA and Pixar, it doesn't feel like it was that you were like you didn't set out necessarily to work in creative and entertainment heavy industries, but you ended up spending a lot of time there. And I'm wondering, and like I said, we'll look at Lucasfilm differently, but the kinds of metrics or things you looked at, is there anything? I mean, I guess first maybe if you want to talk a little bit about the types of metrics you looked at, and then is there, I'm always like when I'm talking to guests and trying to build this sort of career arc, is there anything that you took, because it seems like a big move to go from the entertainment industry to somewhere like LinkedIn, but there is still social engagement with both and everything. So I don't know, what did you kind of take away from it? And was there stuff that you learned there that kind of carried over to subsequent positions?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think when I was at, working in those creative roles or working in those creative companies, I was generally more cost center focused. So what did it take to build these products? Not so focused on the marketing and the sales effort that went into actually, bringing them to market and making sure that you're moving a lot of units or you're getting a lot of eyeballs on them. So in the earlier part of my career working at those types of companies, we spent a lot of time focused on how do we make these games more efficiently over time. So it was really very much, what is our sort of R&D spend or our product spend as a percentage of our revenue? How can we make this game better next year, but for a lower cost? The similar cycle, you introduce kind of like one major feature, two minor features, in the next iteration of, MLB or NHL, whatever this, sports game would be or whatever. And so, you kind of knew what you were going to do each year, and you would be in production on the, if you're putting out the 2010 version, you'd actually start production in 2008. So it was kind of like a 24-month cycle to build these games. So you're always looking at, okay, how can we make this more efficiently? And so one of the things that we ended up exploring and actually spending a lot of time on and a lot of effort on was outsourcing a lot of the artwork asset development. So we moved those to Vietnam or Indonesia was a big one. We did some work in India as well. So having them build the assets for us at a much lower cost. And this was all part of the overall theme of, okay, how do we make these games for less money each year?
As you were sort of putting together sort of the project accounting, is something that was ROI something that you were, reporting on and accountable for, or was it, no, then it goes into, it just becomes a marketing project and it's kind of, we're in the project or we're tracking all the project spend and then, trying to find ways to do it cheaper. And then we're handing it over and it's sort of tracked by another group.
Yeah, that's right. So if you think of the video game business, you can break it into kind of like two distinct buckets. There's the studio business. So that's the people that make the games. And then there's the publishing business. So that's the people that market and sell the games. So we had two different arms at LinkedIn. So I was on the studio side. So when I was there, I think we had probably like close to 20 studios around the world. And then one major publishing arm, which was based in San Francisco. And so we had sales offices in different countries around the world, but most publishing work happened in San Francisco.
That makes sense. Sense. Lucasfilm, though, so that's obviously pre the sale to Disney. And where, I guess, give me a little bit of background on when you were there and what you were doing, because it was, so Lucasfilm privately owned by George Lucas. And I'm wondering if it was different, like managing finances in a company where the primary stakeholder was an individual rather than shareholders. Like, is it, how much did, and also an artist. So, well, that said, Lucas had some very smart business deals with the toys and the products that went along with the movies and stuff. So I would imagine maybe more so than a lot of film directors, he probably had a pretty good handle on business and wanted to track that. But tell me about that. Yeah.
Yeah. I never actually met George, but I did see him on campus once. So that's the closest I ever got. But it was very different. I mean, you go from Electronic Arts, which, a large public company. And I think, when I left there, we were doing around 3 billion a year in sales. So it's not a small company by any means. And then you move to essentially what's a sole proprietorship. And so the focus shifts from, okay, how do you, satisfy the public markets on, what we're doing and what we're building and how do we deliver predictability around this, so shareholders are happy, to essentially it boiled down to managing George's personal tax situation. So how do we structure all of these different businesses, such that it benefits George, in him paying the least amount of tax? And so it's very complex, as you can imagine, because we had a video game business, there was the film business, there was a licensing business, there were studios in the UK, there were studios in Singapore, and then studios in San Francisco. So it was really managing that whole world. So I wasn't in like a corporate type of role there. I was in the video game piece of it because of my background in electronic arts.
Gotcha. Okay,
I
yeah.
was sort of managing, managing sort of like product P&Ls with the development team, similar to EA, sort of the studio side of the business. But we worked a little bit more closely with the publishing arm there because we were based in the same office. But very, very much a different world. As I mentioned, it's really, how do you make this the most beneficial for George at the end of the day?
Yeah, it's funny because I work with a lot of, some early stage startup, but a lot of SMBs and a lot of them, but especially on the consulting side, maybe they even haven't had FP&A before, and I come in, and a lot of times when I come to a business, it was basically the founder's tax accountant was the one that was doing their, air quotes, FP&A for him. And so that, and then thinking about the way you manage a business, they were doing things like cash management was spend as much money as you can by the end of the year. And then they're freaked out that they don't have any cash in Q1, when it comes up, because they had a tax accountant running their business for them. So I imagine, a little bit more sophisticated than that, but you run things differently if you're trying to minimize your tax burden versus growing a business.
Totally. I was just going to add to what you're saying. I mean, at Clearsight IQ, I see the same thing as well. People that are sort of, either they're doing it themselves or they use their personal accountant who's doing their taxes, and a similar kind of idea in that, they're not necessarily looking at it through the right lens, through the FP&A lens. They're really managing it from a different point of view completely than maybe what's best for the business.
Yeah. It worked out pretty good for George. What did he sell? Like 4.5 billion, I think, was the sale.
Yeah, he did. And I remember at the time he sold it, I was tired. So I reported to the general manager at Pixar. And I remember at the time the business was sold, when George sold it, my manager said, "This is a terrible deal for Disney." And he was convinced that they had overpaid. And here we are, it's got to be 10 or 12 or even 14 years later. And I think that investment's worked out very well for Disney at the end of the day.
Yeah, Disney kind of that franchise, along with Marvel, they're squeezing everything they can out of.
They bought them both like right around the same time, and they paid about the same for both. And I think Disney had a long-term plan in place for what they were going to do with this fantastic IP that they got from both of these companies, and they've certainly monetized it the best that they can.
FP&A Today is brought to you by DataRails, the world's #1 FP&A solution. DataRails is the artificial intelligence-powered financial planning and analysis platform built for Excel users. That's right, you can stay in Excel. But instead of facing hell for every budget, month-end close, or forecast, you can enjoy a paradise of data consolidation, advanced visualization, reporting, and AI capabilities. Plus game-changing insights giving you instant answers and your story created in seconds. Find out why more than 1,000 finance teams use DataRails to uncover their company's real story. Don't replace Excel, embrace Excel. Learn more at datarails.com. I want to get to LinkedIn, but before we do, so we talked about EA, we talked about Lucasfilm. What was your role at Pixar?
So at Pixar, I was the head of finance for Pixar's Canadian operations. So when I was with Electronic Arts, my first role with them was in Vancouver. And then I transferred to the head office in Redwood Shores, which is a suburb in the Bay Area. And I was actually recruited by Pixar to come back to Vancouver to head up their finance function. So that was my role there. I sort of did everything. I mean, I had support from the head office for Pixar, which was in Emeryville, another suburb in the Bay Area. And they provided all sort of the back office accounting and that type of stuff. So I was really focused on production planning. How do we make these films? We were focused on short films. How do we make these short films? How do we do it, effectively? And then one of my main roles there was, how do we keep everybody working all the time so that we could maximize our tax credits, which were paid out by both the federal and the provincial government in British Columbia? So one of the things we tried to avoid was downtime. So it was really slotting together all these different people that do all these different functions to make these short films such that everybody was always working on something, because it was much more difficult to get the tax credits if they weren't actually working on an accredited production, is what they sort of referred to it as.
Gotcha. So even at Pixar, would you say that your focus was more kind of that cost center management again, because you're more on that side and not on the distribution, the publishing and distribution side?
It was. And what we were making short films in sort of the Cars and the Toy Story universe. And these would be anything from like 60 seconds to like 4.5 minutes. You'd see these like interstitials on like the Disney Channel. Instead of a commercial break, you might see one of these things. So there was no direct revenue tie-in for these products. It was sort of, the general idea was to keep these characters sort of top of mind for new viewers as they're being born and they're being exposed to the sort of, the Disney and the Pixar universe, so that they would, see these interstitials on Disney Channel. And then the idea was that it would drive sort of pieces of the consumer products business.
Interesting. Okay. So you go from this, creative area where you're really focused on projects and everything, kind of this tight world, to maybe a more traditional, like revenue-focused strategic finance when you move to LinkedIn. But also, that said, the intense focus that you had on these projects, probably that's a mindset that stays with you. And a lot of times it's so easy to just think big picture and think forecast and budget to actuals versus getting down to the project level. So I imagine that there was a lot of strong stuff that came with it. But what were those mindset changes that you had to make? And what advice would you have to FP&A leaders making a similar transition? Or if they haven't really been at that product or project level cost accounting and management, like what's the shift there and what'd you bring with it?
It was a big shift because, as I mentioned before, working in Electronic Arts and Pixar was a lot of cost center management. So really focused on, okay, how do we do things more efficiently here? And then moving to LinkedIn, high growth, I started, shortly after the IPO. So a lot of expectations, for what LinkedIn was going to deliver. And the focus was revenue at all costs. How do we grow revenue here? Not necessarily at all costs. Of course, we're paying attention to the money that we're spending, but at the same time, it was really, the stock price is driven by how quickly the revenue is growing. So it was, it took me a couple months or even a quarter to sort of adjust to that, different frame of mind, because I walked in the door and I knew some people there because I'd worked with them at other companies. So that was good. So I had good people that, I could, no stupid questions, right? I could ask a lot of stuff in the first quarter until I sort of learned what was going on. But my first instinct in my first role there was sort of, okay, well, how do we manage headcount? Because I spent so much time managing headcount at all the, these other companies and not being the biggest sort of cost item. Okay, how do we manage headcount? And I sort of quickly learned it's not that important at the end of the day because nobody's asking about this. Everybody just keeps asking about bookings and revenue. So let's put our focus on that. So it took a while to sort of adjust to that. But then once I sort of, grasped that, hey, this is really the important thing that we do here, it sort of changed where I put my focus. And I would say I shifted, focusing like 80 or 90% on top line and, sort of 10% on expenses at the end of the day.
Interesting. So at that point, I don't know where LinkedIn was on their sort of their, profitability, but it sounds like that aggressive revenue targets were the goal.
Yeah. So I joined when the company was around $1 billion in revenue, and we were maybe just shy of 4,000 headcount. Yeah, fantastic experience. I learned so much there. So many smart people working in a company like that.
Yeah. And you got stretched into areas that you hadn't done before. So you're doing central forecasting, you're doing M&A, and then the post-acquisition work with Microsoft. And I'm curious about that one in particular, because whenever there's an acquisition and you say, okay, well, there were, 20,000 employees in this revenue, like what synergies are going to come from rolling it up under the Microsoft umbrella, and then though you start to, maybe that's when you shift focus from, okay, this is our revenue target to, okay, now we need to come up with a profitability plan and figure out how it fits in the portfolio. So walk me through kind of those shifts and what you were doing there.
Yeah. So the M&A is a good one because I supported our corporate development team from an FP&A point of view. So I worked with them on a lot of the modeling on any of the acquisitions we did. Sort of, we had some acquisition by Microsoft and some after. So I worked on probably about 10 different acquisitions there. And that was a new world for me. That was really interesting. I really enjoyed that actually, because everyone
you were in the due diligence phase.
Exactly. Yeah. So they bring me in pretty early on these deals. I mean, Corp Dev was always looking for, okay, what do we need? What are we going to bring in? What kind of, what tech do we need? Or, are we going to do an acqui-hire? Or what is it that we're going to do here? So Corp Dev was always working on those types of things. And then when it looked like they had sort of a bit of a green light, like this might be a good fit for us, then they'd usually loop in the FP&A team. And so that would be our head of FP&A and then myself. And then I had an analyst on my team that would help me with this stuff. So totally different world. I never worked on M&A on the first one. And then what I learned on the very first one we did, which actually went through and was a successful deal, was it's go time all the time when M&A is happening. And so it was kind of, some late nights and, I don't know, probably got up to like version 65 on the model, right? It was just constantly changing everything all the time to see how this was going to fit into our business. So super good experience. Really enjoyed that. Really enjoyed that a lot, actually. It was, it's some long nights and some, hard work in there, but really interesting stuff to work on because things are changing so quickly. So really enjoyed that. And then with the acquisition by Microsoft, that was different. No, we were being bought. And so it was really interesting because there was only a certain, handful of people that were in on what was going on in the very beginning. So our FP&A team, the people that got looped in that weren't told exactly what was going on, we were told that we were under audit and we had to produce a certain set of documents for this. So that was kind of the first sort of 6 or 8 weeks of it before we were sort of drawn in and told, okay, you're now in the circle of trust. Microsoft's interested in buying us. There's other potential buyers out there as well. And it was a lot of, first of all, getting to the deal getting done. So that was phase one. And then we spent probably like 6 months in sort of, the regulatory period and going through due diligence and having all of those things sort of like wrapped up to sort of finish the deal, which was also a tremendous amount of work. I remember the day it was announced. It was super cool, actually. Everybody got, pulled into the boardroom that we had in our sort of FP&A area, and, big announcement and well, it was already public at that point because, it was announced at the opening market, but very cool thing to go through.
Yeah. And, if you're building kind of the perfect FP&A foundation, so starting with your accounting training, the intensive program you had there, and then, several years of focusing on project accounting and looking at that, and then coming into M&A. My first FP&A role was in telecom, and this was in the early 2000s, where our company was very acquisitive, and there was a lot of consolidation in the industry, and we were doing 1 to 2 like merger of equal size mergers every year, and then multiple tuck-ins. Bringing everything from very small, like almost acqui-hire, and maybe a little more than that, but bringing in these deals just to try to grow that revenue line. But getting that M&A experience both on the buy and the sell side, where you sort of understand, on a more tangible level, business valuation and why they're looking at certain things, and it helps you kind of. For me, it seemed like those were the kind of things that, and then I was in private equity backed businesses beyond that. But it trains you to look at what are the metrics that are meaningful, that actually are a lever that can drive something. I mean, did you find a lot of your learnings through the M&A activity were around, this is what businesses value and this is why I did it kind of beyond?
Yeah, it was, I'd had some, exposure to business valuation through my education, but in the real world, it doesn't hold up anymore. Everything changes very much when you're actually looking at, a real business that you're going to fold into a different business. So it was really interesting. Everyone was different. I mean, sometimes we were buying the company because, the biggest one we did at LinkedIn was lynda.com, which became LinkedIn Learning, and that was $1.5 billion acquisition. So a huge company, and created a whole new product line for LinkedIn. So that was a big deal. You're obviously going to spend $1.5 billion. You're going to work very hard, make sure you understand how that's going to fit into the company. But then even smaller ones like acqui-hires of, 6 people or something like that, right? They all take on their own different flavor as you're working through them.
Yeah, because you've got the, some that you built for the customer base or for a new segment, and there's the different reasons, the strategic acquisition. So it is fun to see, how those businesses are valued. And I think it's probably good prep for what you're doing now. I know maybe a lot of your businesses are much smaller scale, but they're building to sell or whatever they're doing, and you've already got that mindset and thinking.
It's fantastic experience for the sort of things I offer to my clients today, because a lot of them are exactly as you said. They're either looking to, they're looking for that strategic acquisition or perhaps, a private equity buyer, but they all have some sort of exit plan in place. So being able to sort of help them figure out, okay, what's the appropriate valuation here? which is it's honestly a little bit more art than science at the end of the day, because no two companies are the same. You can do all the benchmarking you want, but you can never find that situation that fits exactly with your current client and the thing you're trying to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's why it turns into a negotiation, I suppose, right?
Yeah.
Everybody's got their number that they want. Yeah.
Yeah. So also at LinkedIn, one of your key projects was creating the virtual P&Ls we talked about before the show. And I'm wondering, how did that change the way that the leaders made decisions? And kind of walk me through what you were building there and how other companies, maybe if that's something you apply to your clients now, or walk me through that.
Yeah. So virtual P&L. So this is something that was, the concept of this was brought to us post-acquisition by Microsoft. And so the way that they look at all of their businesses is through something called the unit of accountability. So they break all their businesses down into their own separate P&Ls, and then everything becomes fully allocated. So you've got, you can tie out every last dollar and it ties back to your P&L. So after we were acquired, we were talking to them about, how to manage these different businesses. And so they said, why don't you take a crack at something like this? So I spearheaded that project and built out the virtual P&Ls across our sort of 4 main businesses and then our consumer business as well. The same idea. So the top line piece, super easy because you know where the money's coming from. When you get into the engineering and the product effort, you have a pretty good idea of what's being spent, but there is this whole layer that needs to be allocated. So there was a lot of effort went into, okay, how do we figure out how to allocate these costs properly? And then of course you have your overhead after the fact, which you can talk about that, how you want to allocate that. But we tended to look at it without the overhead allocated and then with the overhead allocated, because it really was it's whatever allocation methodology you choose for the overhead doesn't really have anything to do with the underlying business. So we tended to look at it before the overhead was allocated. And the idea behind this was to give autonomy to each of the owners in these business lines, so almost like a general manager type structure. So we had a sales leader and a product leader for each one. And the idea was to move some of the decision-making away from the CEO and the CFO and put the decision-making on the general managers of these businesses. So if they were overperforming on revenue, we had a deal. We said, okay, 50% of that comes back to the company and the other 50% you can reinvest in your own business line if you want to. If you can find something that makes sense for you to invest in there. Of course, FP&A would support the analysis to make sure that it all made sense and everything else. But it was kind of like, okay, well, we'll split the profits and then the rest of it goes into the coffers of the CFO for sort of larger initiatives. It took, as you can imagine, large business, it took like a year to get this thing sort of built out and up and running, and everybody sort of bought into the way that it was going to work. And it was still running when I left. So I left there in 2022. I don't know if it's still going today, but it was still being used at the time that I left.
So those allocations are interesting because when I was spent that part of my career that with the PE-backed companies, I would come in a lot of the time where pretty long in the tooth on the investment and they were looking to get out. And, a lot of times I'd come in and the accounting would be, that maybe they had departments or divisions or whatever, but the way they were, maybe they weren't allocating software, across the different departments if you're trying to, especially if you have different business units or if you're trying to set it up so you could potentially do a spinoff or something there, like trying to get those allocations straight. It's a lot of times it felt like it was more art than science because you have to choose what methodology. Is it, percent of revenue? Is it percent of total cost? Is it based on the number of people we have, the number of hours, so doing those allocations and building those out, and then it becomes the justification because as long as everything looks great, the way you've allocated it, everybody's fine. But if somebody feels like, well, now my P&L doesn't look that good, then they want to push back on it. Did you run into a lot of that as well? Or
every single day? Maybe that's an overstatement, but I mean, I can't tell you how many meetings we had on deciding how to allocate these things. As you mentioned, you look at like a percentage of bookings or a percentage of revenue, or headcount. Those are all common drivers that you would use for this kind of thing. And, there was always an argument for why this didn't make sense for me, whoever the person was that was going to be eating this cost at the end of the day. It was hard to get everybody on the same page, as far as doing that, because everybody would sort of, hey, this hurts my profitability at the end. It makes me look worse than the other guy.
Yeah.
So what we would find happened actually. So we did quarterly business reviews like a lot of companies do, and this virtual P&L will be part of the QBR presentation materials. And so there would be an FP&A team for each of these 5 business lines. And what we found is they would take the the stock P&L, which we would give them their virtual P&L. And then they would discuss after the fact, maybe some adjustments that would be made in there. And so they would sort of try to highlight, hey, maybe we're a little bit more profitable than it looks because of, A, B, and C. And so we didn't necessarily get involved and say, hey, you can't do that. We said, you have to start with the real view. And then if you want to talk a little bit about why, maybe you're being allocated something and it doesn't make sense, that's okay. You can include that in the discussion. And I didn't see any of these QBRs go, completely sideways on any of those types of discussions, right? I think everybody caught it.
It's funny, you're giving me, I'm just having flashbacks to some board meetings where, being in there, presenting in another, whether CRO, COO or whatever, deciding that's the moment that they want to talk about why these allocations don't work and why their number is really the right number. And
isn't that so frustrating? I mean, I've been in lots of those scenarios as well. And you almost feel like you're sort of blindsided and you're sort of thinking, why did you pick now?
Yeah.
To bring this up, because I've run into this, with different folks and people I have a good relationship with, and we could have discussed this ahead of time and come up with a better way to do it rather than, put me on my back foot in the meeting and have to sort of justify this in front of a group of people that, probably don't even really care a whole lot about this. And it's really a distraction at the end of the day.
Yeah. That sounds like someone who's been through the battles. So you've gone through at these big companies, and then you go to BioRender where you're brought in, and I love this kind of assignment because you're brought in to build FP&A from the ground up. And, I'd much rather, if I've got to do an ERP installation, I'd rather be starting from the beginning than trying to come in and inherit somebody's bad implementation and take that over or whatever. And kind of with FP&A, like they, depending on the data maturity and the, where the company is, if you're coming in and it's bad at, if there's data issues or data governance or don't have a good, everybody's using kind of their own KPIs, it can be a mess to clean it up because then you've got sort of a change management thing. But if you come in and you're doing FP&A, the first person to do it, you become it. If you do it right, you're a hero, and everybody's like, "Oh my God, you're giving me such great insights into my business that we never had before." So it's it's a lot of work, but it seems it's much more rewarding than fixing bad FP&A. So walk me through and maybe really focus on because it's all when you come in there, it's like that first 3 months or that first 100 days, whatever it is. Like, how did you kind of break down the project? What did you prioritize first? What were those first 3 months like?
Yeah, great question. And I think you nailed it when you said rewarding. It is really rewarding to come in with sort of a blank slate and be able to build it up into something that makes sense. So it was fantastic work. I really enjoyed doing it. It was great. So first thing first was, I spent my first week sort of sifting through data and just looking at what they had. Okay, their CRM was on HubSpot. The data in there was a mess. They had just hired a director of RevOps prior to me joining. And thankfully, actually, she also came from LinkedIn. So we were sort of speaking the same language, which was great. So that was a great partner to have on that. So there was a lot of effort went into, working with her to clean up CRM data and get that into a point where we could say, okay, this is what's happened. Let's start using this to build out some models and look at what's going to happen in the future. So first thing was to build out the field sales model because we were making a big investment in a sales-led motion. So that was where the growth was going to come from. So we had a consumer business as well, but that was sort of secondary. That was going to be kind of, it was going to keep running and it was going to be fine, but the real growth was going to come from, to sort of the enterprise side. So the first thing was to build that out. And then I focused next on the consumer business and then folding that all into a P&L and, that was showing adjusted EBITDA and then regular EBITDA as well after that. And that really caught my manager was actually a guy who had come up through sort of the controllership side. And so he was, it was really interesting. I think he was a little bit blindsided that I did this adjusted EBITDA thing and then, broke it down to EBITDA after that. And he was like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, no, we need to talk about what's actually going on in the business. And so we ended up sort of chatting with one of the founders about it. He's like, I agree, adjusted EBITDA is the right way to look at it because, some of these things just don't make sense to include in there or whatever. So that was when I sort of first knew, I'm working with someone who's much more on the accounting side as my manager, that I really was going to be sort of the FP&A expert. So we started with that. And then we went to building out reporting and then building out quota models. So we know what we were going to do with our salespeople because quotas had sort of been set, willy-nilly prior to that. And as I mentioned, we were investing pretty heavily in a sales-led motion. So we were hiring BDRs, we were hiring AEs, we had AE 1 through 4, depending on sort of the market that you were focused on. And then we had sales managers and a sales director and a head of sales. So we had to build out all these different comp plans, so that everybody sort of knew what was going on. And then same thing on the customer success side. We had, renewal targets and things like that, but there was not a lot of thought really being put into it. So it was kind of like everybody was kind of doing a little bit their own thing, and the business was going very well. There's a company that had product market fit very early, and they've been cash flow positive very early. So, a great story, which sort of allowed them to maybe not be as buttoned up as they, other companies might be if they really needed to pay more attention to, how much cash was coming in the door. And I still remember one of the things, after I built out the first sort of bottles, going back to one of the founders and saying, okay, now do you mind sharing your model or whatever you have? I'm just curious, are we in the same ballpark here? And he said, oh, no, we don't have anything. This is why we hired you. This is what you're here for. We don't know what's happening in the future. That's kind of your job to figure out where this business is going. So that was really eye-opening because they really had nothing, absolutely nothing when I got there. It was like a blank workbook for me, and I could do whatever I wanted with it. So the autonomy was great. And I think they hired me because I could draw on my experience from, all those different companies and have the ability to sort of like build out something that made sense. I understood SaaS metrics and the SaaS business model and everything else, so I think, I think that's probably why I got the job at the end of the day.
And remind me what BioRender does.
Oh, so they, the easiest way to describe it is they make like a PowerPoint type product for, it's a cloud-based PowerPoint type product for visualizing science. So if you work in either academia or in like a big pharma, you're doing R&D, and so they give you all the icons and templates to sort of visualize the science that you do. So it's much easier to communicate. In the past, people would use PowerPoint, and there would be all these ugly shapes and stuff like that. And so they sort of streamline the whole process. You get like a canvas, and then by the time I left, I think they were up to like, 12,000 icons that you could use, like T cells and different connectors and all this kind of stuff or whatever. So you'd use it to visualize your science.
Gotcha. And when they brought you in, so they were revenue and cash flow positive, and they were kind of just bootstrapped, founder led.
Yeah, exactly. They'd done quite well up to that point, and they were really like, okay, this thing is working. Let's like go full speed ahead.
Gotcha.
Sort of thing. And so, to do that, they wanted to do a fundraise. And so part of my job was to get everything in place, so that we could go through the Series A process.
Yeah. At that point, was their accounting pretty solid? Like they were audit ready and they were good to go there. It was just they'd never done FP&A.
Yeah, the accounting side was good. So I joined, like I mentioned, the head of finance was, a guy who comes from sort of, a controllership type background. So, he was very, very strong, very good. And under him, there was a controller in place as well. And she was also very strong. So as far as, their historical financial data and their close processes and stuff like that, it was all buttoned up. They were very good at that. So that made it easy for me because I didn't have to work on the quality of that data. At least I knew I could rely on that. CRM was a little different because there was no RevOps in place until, I mentioned the woman that came from LinkedIn. And so you had reps just going in there and plugging in whatever they wanted.
Yeah, the pipeline is massive, but the win is
so you couldn't
so
make
low
sense of anything. So we had to do a massive cleanup on that. We eventually moved from HubSpot to Salesforce. We hired a Salesforce admin, and like as you grow as a company, these things all make sense. And so we brought some structure and some rigor to that, which made it a lot better over time. But at least the financial data was reliable. And I have one huge benefit, I think, which was I inherited I think his title was senior accountant, and they moved him over to FP&A when I joined as an FP&A analyst. And he'd been there for 3 years already. And so he'd seen everything that had happened. And so he was such a great resource for me.
Yeah.
He'd worked through everything. He knew all the numbers inside and out. He knew the consumer business well. He had a pretty good understanding of how, the sales-led motion was going to work. He was very, very beneficial to have as sort of my first hire. I didn't hire him, I got him, but he was super strong, very, very, very buttoned up.
So they were doing a Series A when you joined, and they had good accounting, which is funny. I think about like in the VC world, the idea of a Series A company actually having good accounting. It's like, no, that just doesn't happen. It's just a mess. It's like they're in QuickBooks or Xero or something, and everything is just kind of,
Yeah.
it's a blend of like cash and accrual at the same time, and they
And
don't
nobody
know
knows.
what.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, but it's funny though because there's head of finance at a startup. There's the early stage startups. Everybody wants to draw the chart that has the hockey stick, and they've got whatever model they're basing on, has so many assumptions and assumes this inflection point. But I guess, they had a business track record at that point and good accounting and everything. But what do you think it was that they knew they needed FP&A to do that Series A? What did they think that investors were going to be asking or looking for that they weren't providing just with solid accounting?
Yeah, I think it was really having the forecast about what was going to happen next. It's great to look at what has happened, but that's not necessarily what you're buying. You're buying what's going to happen next. And so I think that was the thing where they realized, okay, we need somebody in here with like very strong modeling skills to be able to put together forecasts and models, and make them relatively bulletproof so we can talk about, okay, what's expected to happen over the next, 2 to 5 years sort of thing.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And I also find, I think with like accountants are great at accounting for sure, and they're great at tying out financial statements, but they don't necessarily have that, similar, sort of business acumen. So when it came to things like, metrics and stuff like that, it's almost like a different world for them because it's not part of their, gap training. You know what I mean? Like it's not something that they think about on a regular basis. So having to do, bring some flexibility into like a CAC calculation, right? They would want to do it like a very structured way. And whereas you're like, it's maybe a little bit more nuanced than that. Maybe we should look at this a little bit differently. So I think it's bringing that little bit different lens to be able to sort of tell maybe a bit more of a compelling story to potential investors.
Yeah. So you had this long background of working for these big, cool companies that everybody knows and all that. And then you make the decision, and then BioRender, you're setting up FP&A. And I'm wondering in that transition, I want to move into like you go from this corporate world where you have all these resources and all this data and all these great things to use to now your own business and this, working with maybe smaller companies, less data mature companies and everything. So first off, tell me a little bit about Clearsight IQ, what you guys do.
Yeah, so it's a fractional CFO consulting firm. And so I focus on sort of 4 pillars, strategic finance, something called FP&A as a service, fundraising support, and then M&A readiness. So those are sort of the 4 pillars that I offer. And working with my clients are sort of, pre-revenue up to about 25 million in ARR. That's kind of the sweet spot. I think anybody beyond that has, someone like me already on staff, right? So they don't necessarily need extra support. It's sort of helping those companies, whether it's founders or they might have some kind of finance function in place, helping those people, sort of realize what they can get from an FP&A type function.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I talk to a lot of fractional CFOs and people that go out on their own, and it's interesting. But I think that your focus, that 25 million and lower, they're not going to hire. They don't have the resources to hire a full-time CFO. But they, a lot of them, like I said, their tax guy has been doing their books and doing air quote FP&A for them. So I think there is a demand there. And if you think just about the number of businesses that size versus the big logos, but what is it that made you? I mean, you could have gone to another big Fortune 100 company if you wanted, probably, and continued there versus now come into this kind of messy startup world and doing, instead of working for a big company, doing the solopreneur thing. Walk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, it's a great question. I was at this sort of 20-year mark in my career. And really what I was looking for at that point was, like you said, I did some big company stuff, private company stuff, the startup world, like all fantastic experience. And really what I was after at the end of the day was not doing more of that. Right. So it's always about growing and doing different things. And so I wanted to do something completely different. And so I decided to sort of, branch out and do my own thing with Clearsight IQ, really as almost like a lifestyle business. I'm not trying to grow it into a large consultancy where I'm going to have, 20 employees or something like that. I really just want to do my own thing. and ideally, build it up to like a 75% capacity sort of thing. My kids are getting older. I want to spend as much time with them before they go away to school. And so it was really just a question of, okay, well, how do I keep working and do stuff that's interesting to me, but still have the flexibility to, spend time with my family? Like in the startup world, burnout's a real thing there. Right. So if I was going to go to another startup, I'd be staring down, more 60 or 70-hour weeks kind of thing, and working, very hard to help the company be successful, which is great. I enjoy that work. But then when I sort of looked at it in terms of, okay, my whole life and how does this fit together? Is this really what I want to look back on and say, this is what I spent, all these years doing? So I love the work. It's really interesting to me, but being able to do it and then also being able to have sort of, the lifestyle piece of it as well. This seemed like the best way to go about it. So, when I was thinking about leaving BioRender, I talked to my wife about it and sort of pitched this idea, and she's been very supportive. She's like, yeah, go for it. Do whatever you think is going to be good. And she sort of said, try it for a couple of years. If you don't like it, go back and do one of the things you did before. Having that backing from my wife and the flexibility to kind of, figure out what I want to do myself, has been fantastic. Yeah. So I'm very happy with how it's going. I've given myself sort of very reasonable, targets for the first couple of years for this business, and I'm on pace to achieve my sort of first year sales target. So I'm really happy with how it's going. I think it's been a good move.
It's funny, and maybe this isn't a fair stereotype, and especially with business partnering and all that. And FP&A, it's different than, sitting there with a 10 key and the green visor and going through and entering credits and debits. But that said, for a finance person, biz dev and sales are hard. So you talked about hitting your sales targets, and, now you have to spend a fair amount of your time, I would imagine, doing the biz dev part. Did you find that was something that came naturally to you, or how do you approach it? And
it did not come naturally at all. I'm a finance person through and through. I'm very much an introvert. So, throwing yourself out there and talking to people and trying to sort of pitch what you're doing in a salesy but not salesy kind of way is it's a learned skill. It's not something that anybody's good at right out of the gate. Before I decided to go down this path, I reached out to a number of peers that I'd worked with and just sort of said, hey, I'm thinking about doing this. What do you think? And they're like, yeah, I think it's a great idea. You can totally do it. Like, go for it. And then the next step was to reach out to other fractional CFOs, people I didn't know, and just say, hey, what's your experience been like? This is my background. Do you think I can be successful? And so what I found was that sort of fractional CFO world is everybody's very helpful and very supportive. And so people were, even though you're maybe even competing with them for clients, everybody was kind of like, yeah, you have the right background for this. You're going to be successful for sure. Don't get stuck, right? If you don't get, if you're not doing a lot of work in the first, 3 months, don't give up. Like, it's going to take some time to get some clients and stuff like that. And I was very fortunate. I got a couple of small clients right away. So I was sort of like, okay, this is easy. It's not actually easy. You just have to keep your foot on the gas with the biz dev effort for sure to make sure you have, more clients coming in. It's gone well, but it has been, taking me out of my comfort zone for sure, to do that. I go to networking events and I do, I reach out to random people through LinkedIn that I think might be, either could use my service or know someone who could use my service. And so, you sort of have to be ready for the rejection that comes along with that. I've had a number of good introductory calls with potential clients that look like it's going somewhere, and then they ghost me, which hurt me a little in the beginning. And now I just realized that's just part of the game. And so, it doesn't affect me like it did, even 6 months ago, sort of thing, when I was trying to get this thing off the ground.
That's funny. So not a lot of my time is spent on business development, but when it does, like I'm still in that phase where, when I do get ghosted, I thought we had this relationship. What's going on? I thought, but then when I talk to the sales team in our company, and like the other funny thing is that I could never make myself do. They will just keep like pestering and driving there's like a salesperson out, like it doesn't have the sort of cringe factor that I do of like, I don't know, I've already emailed that person 3 times and they haven't responded. The fourth would be too much. And the sales guy's like, oh no, we're just getting started. We're going to hit them again. And then it's crazy how many though actually can end up converting after
Well,
that.
that's the funny thing. One of the clients that I'm working with right now, I reached out to one of the first people. I got sort of a warm intro from somebody that I knew here in Victoria, and we had a call and great conversation, and he was like, that maybe sometime I might need some of your help or whatever. And that was sort of it. I sent a couple of follow-ups, a couple months later, hey, how's it going, sort of thing, and respond, yeah, everything's great. And that was the end of it. And then out of nowhere, 3 weeks ago, they're like, hey, I need a ton of help on this project I'm working on right now. I need some help with, putting together some board materials, and I'm doing a pricing analysis, and like, can you help? And so you just never know where the business is going to come from. So I think, the advice you're getting, which is to like, just keep it warm, with the people that you're dealing with. You never know when they're going to come back to you again. So I just try to stay top of mind with people that look like they could use my service at some point.
Yeah. And I guess we've drifted a bit, astray from FP&A, but I just, on that point, a client that I've been working with for a year and a half now, finally, this Friday, we're kicking off a project. And it's the same thing. And the sales guy that worked with me on it, said, no's come quick. So if you don't get that no, you just keep, keep going. And now,
it's a great point, because, you're talking about sending the follow on. It's 3 too many, and then 4, and so, you space these things out and you try to stay top of mind. And so I had a great introductory call with a potential client, and to the point where, I thought we were going to work together for sure, sign an NDA, set up a shared folder, moving some documents around and stuff like that. And then nothing. So I keep following up, and I keep not hearing no. So I'll just keep following up, right? It might turn into something at some point.
Yeah. So, well, that is, and also, if you like different challenges, when you're doing the fractional, you kind of get to do everything you did before, but sort of at scale, in that you're doing it at different companies and all that.
I think that's right. Yeah. I think one of the things I really like, and I know this is probably like my inner nerd coming out here, is I really like building stuff in spreadsheets. Like, I enjoy that kind of work. And then, if you look back to my time at LinkedIn, leading central forecasting, I was managing a revenue forecast of about $13 billion when I left. I was not in spreadsheets doing anything. I had a team of people working on that stuff. Yeah. I would be reviewing things, asking questions, and saying, is this how this really works? And maybe we should dig into this and that kind of. So you're using a totally different skill set from, that actually like banging on the keyboard and building stuff. So going to BioRender was great, because there was nobody else. So I had to go and do all that stuff. And I really enjoy that kind of work. And I got to a similar position with them, that I had a team of 6 by the time that I left. And again, I moved out of doing that work. So doing it for yourself, I'm right in the spreadsheets every single day. And like I said, maybe this is my inner nerd coming out, but I really enjoy that kind of work. I like building stuff in spreadsheets. It's fun for me.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, because when I was CFO, I had moved so far away from actually putting anything together. And I used to pride myself on my Excel skills, but when you're more of a recipient than a builder, they tend to go down. And I'd been a CFO for, I don't know, a decade at this point, and I decided I'm going to go get my FMVA from the Corporate Finance Institute. And I went and I did this intensive thing just so I could get back in and build a 3-statement model again. Yeah. And I probably never actually built one all the way by myself again, but it was like, all right, I still got it. I remember the keyboard shortcuts and, and how to carry it through. So I get you on that, because it's, at some point you stop doing and you start managing, and it does feel good, that satisfaction of actually building something and seeing that part of it.
I like doing the analysis piece of it. When I was at BioRender, one of the analysts on my team was a CFA, and he was a very good modeler. And you sort of realize, I've lost some skill over time here. And we actually did at BioRender, we did 2-way performance reviews. I would give him a review, and he would review me as his manager. And I remember he put in my performance review that I was an okay modeler. And I was like, I'm kind of stunned a little bit, because I thought I was pretty good. He was night and day better than me, and I'm not going to debate that. But, just that he said I was okay, it kind of was like, oh, maybe I got to brush up on my skills here.
Yeah, that's funny. But we are getting to the point of the show where I'm supposed to start winding it down. I think before I took over, I think these podcasts ran about 40 minutes. I feel like I'm getting into like who's or the like Joe Rogan or the other the 3 and 4 hour podcast people out there. I don't know, as much as I love FP&A, I don't know who's going to commit to the 3 hour podcast, but we're so as I wind it down, we've got our sort of switching over to the personal side questions, and the one we ask all the guests is, what's something that not many people know about you, maybe outside of your work interests, and that we couldn't find from quickly Googling you or whatever.
Yeah. At LinkedIn, when we did introductions, you would introduce yourself and you would say something that's not on my LinkedIn profile to sort of answer this question. So something that's not on my LinkedIn profile. I actually lived in Cambodia for a year at the time that, I mentioned before, I worked as an English teacher. I lived in Cambodia for a year and I worked for the World Wildlife Fund there. This is not on my LinkedIn profile. Not that many people know that about me. I was hired to build a database for all of their library materials for researchers that were working in Cambodia. And it paid $600 per month. Which doesn't sound like a lot of money, but in Cambodia, $600 goes a long way. Yeah. And so that's something that probably not a ton of people know about me.
Well, very cool. And since you are now getting back into Excel and you are in the models a lot, I'm curious, and I'm gonna ask you the question, but I wonder if maybe it has changed from back in your early days in Excel. But what is your current favorite Excel function and why?
So I use a lot of index match to be able to sort of consolidate, a bunch of raw data into a way that I want to be able to work with it. In the olden days, when I was sort of learning my chops in modeling, I was big on sum if and VLOOKUPs, and then XLOOKUP was a game changer when that came.
Yeah.
So, I could talk about this for hours because I'm in there doing all this stuff all the time. Something I will say is I rely on ChatGPT quite a bit now to help me write formulas. It's very effective if you sort of tell it what you want it to do, because I might, there's in Excel, there's 15 different ways you can do it, right? And maybe maybe you're going to do the thing that has 6 different functions tied together, and ChatGPT can do it for you, in one and make it a little bit more streamlined. So I'm actually relying on that quite a bit when I'm building stuff these days.
Yeah, and on that note, I use ChatGPT occasionally for formulas, but it's kind of, you have to come out of Excel and you have to say which cell and what you're referencing it. So it's a little bit clunky, but I'm telling you, and working for LinkedIn and as they rolled into Microsoft didn't spend $15 billion investing in AI so that people would have to come in. I know Copilot's getting there, but when they get to that,
Yes.
that what they're picturing is Clippy's revenge. They're finally going to bring back, so you can just be in Excel and all that stuff that, those of us that have been in the industry a while that we prided ourselves on, coming up, all the cool things that we could do in Excel and the models we could build and the sum ifs and the nested if statements and just these super complex models. That's all going to be replaced when someone can just type in, hey, build me a pivot table with slicers on this data and show it this way. And then it's just going to spit it out. So that's where it's going.
I think that's totally right. I think that's where we're headed. I've tried using Copilot within Excel and it never does the thing I want it to do. So it's not there yet. I have no doubt they're going to figure it out. But if you go, or if your listeners go and they look, they have to go back probably maybe 18 months and search. There's a 30-minute presentation by Satya Nadella on what Copilot was going to do for PowerPoint and for Excel. There's a fantastic example of what it could do or what they envision it doing there inside Excel, which is, it's marketing material right now. But I do think that they'll get there. Just the ability to sort of type in questions like, why did sales suffer in Q2 in this region? And it's like, oh, these 3 customers churned and whatever it was, right? Like it's able to it knows what you're looking for. And it's able to figure it out for you.
Yeah. And again, $15 billion invested, they're going to get there. So, yeah. So, well, I really appreciate your time on the show. I guess before we let you go, where can our listeners connect with you and learn more about the work, find out more about ClearSight?
Yeah. So you can find me on LinkedIn, obviously, so under Craig Berry. And then I have a website, clearsightIQ.com, and you can reach out to me there. There's links on the website, or you could just reach out directly, info@clearsightIQ.com.
Great. All right. Well, Craig, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Glenn. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for the time today.